Hey, welcome everybody. We just did the soft start. We're a couple of minutes early here with Nicholas Kaufmann and John Foster. Hey guys. So yeah,
Hola.
Hello.
we'll just hang out for a couple of minutes. We'll give people a chance to get into the stream. So yeah, Nick was just telling me before we went live about all the different versions of the Christmas Carol out there and ranking them. And what would you say was the Alistair Sim one? That's
Yeah,
constantly at the
that's
top.
usually at the top of the list on the rankings I've seen, and I think that's from like 1941. I think I've seen a colorized version. You know how like
Oh,
TBS will show like colorized versions of old movies and stuff. I think I've seen the colorized version years ago, but I'd like to check it out again in its original black and white.
yeah, the Sim one is really good. And it deserves its reputation. I prefer the George C. Scott version. Um, he's such a powerful actor, and his transformation at the end. Not that I'm giving away spoilers, but when he sort of has his heart opens up. It's so joyous that I just find it infectious when I'm watching it. It makes me very happy.
He's a great actor.
Yeah.
I recently saw the one with Patrick Stewart, which I guess was on television a decade or two ago, but I just watched it on YouTube and then I started scrolling on YouTube through some of the older ones.
There's some
I
animated
guess
ones as well.
what's
There's
that?
what?
There's some animated ones as well.
Oh wow.
I've never seen them.
I think the Patrick Stewart one has the distinction. That one and one of the older ones, I guess, are the only two that showed Tiny Tim dead in there. That's pretty cool because the Ghost of Christmas Future is definitely my favorite one. My favorite ghost.
It's interesting, and particularly in the Scott version. I actually find the ghost of Christmas Present to be the most frightening. He's completely pagan,
Yeah.
and he's a giant. He's like 7 feet tall.
He's the
Mm.
closest one they have to Santa Claus of all of the three
Yeah,
spirits.
and he's laughing and jolly, but he starts getting very sarcastic and cutting, and you realize pagan spirits are not gentle things. These
Yeah.
are dangerous beings, and you can see that there's unlike the Christmas Future is terrifying right from the moment. The Christmas Present becomes terrifying. You realize he's sort of holding it back, and I just find that scary.
Well, in the book, he does sort of the same thing. It's not sarcasm. He's throwing Scrooge's words back at him. The words that he had said earlier are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Um, yeah, but he's a bastard.
Yeah.
All the spirits are jerks. I'm on Scrooge's side.
What?
Really? All right.
He's terrible.
We're gonna run we'll leave a minute or two of silent reflection on Scrooge the Bastard. Team Ghosts, Team Scrooge. And with that, we'll do our hard start and we'll come back for the show in just a minute. Okay, we're back. We're starting the show. Welcome. And happy Christmas Eve and Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight, for joining us for the festival. Thanks to John Foster and Nicholas Kaufmann, who are joining us tonight, which is night 6 of the first annual New York Ghost Story Festival, which is an annual event of readings and discussions featuring authors of the uncanny, the strange, and fantastic from New York and from around the globe. My name is Daniel Braum. I am the founder of the event and your host. I am an author of strange tales and ghost stories. My most recent book of them is called Underworld Dreams. Welcome to night 6, the final night. This year, too, because of the pandemic, we are online only. We're going to be back in 2021 with more of the same, some new stuff, and a mix of in-person and online features. Like I said, I'm here with Nicholas Kaufmann and John Foster, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. I'm going to be light on my opening remarks. I will not be reading full essays by the great Robert Aikman or anything similar tonight. I will mention so far during the festival, which you can tune into on the same YouTube channel. We've been exploring all kinds of ghost stories from a wide range of time periods. We've been exploring way out to the outer boundaries. A great quote from our guest, Jeffrey Ford, who said, "You don't need to have a ghost to have a ghost story. You just need a haunting." But tonight is going to be full of ghosts. Tonight, we're going to move back from those outer edges, and we're going to have classics. We're going to have some modern classics, and we're going to have atmosphere. So before we get started, I'll say this festival is not for profit. It's an educational and artistic venture. We have a Ko-Fi account. I'll run that during the course of the night. Any donations made go towards our subscription, production, and advertising costs. The other bit that's also important to mention is I've asked each author throughout the festival, and tonight is no exception, to give us a name of their local or independent bookstore. If you like to shop local or if you like to support them, that's I know they could use the support to support indie bookstores and indie publishers. So that being said, onward to the guests. Who are here. Let's see if I could get them all on the screen at the same time. Let's see if I can get the mics working at the same time. So I'm here with John Foster and Nicholas Kaufmann.
Hello.
Hey guys, I'm going to read your biographies, introduce you, and we'll go on to the ghost stories. So I'm here with John Foster. Let me put him on the screen. John C. Foster was born in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and has been afraid of the dark for as long as he can remember. His most recent novel, The Isle, grew out of his love for New England, where he spent his childhood. He is the author of 3 previous novels, Dead Men, Night Roads, and Mr. White, and 1 collection of short stories, Baby Powder and Other Terrifying Substances. He has crime novels in the works, and his stories have appeared in magazines and anthologies, including The 7 Deadliest, Dark Moon Digest, Strange Aeons, Death's Realm, and Lost Film, among others. Some of those short stories I want to point out to you are Stuck Bucky from Strange Aeons, Girl 6 from Dark Moon Digest, Talk to Leo in the collection Baby Powder and Other Terrifying Substances, and also A Lamb to Slaughter from Baby Powder and Other Terrifying Substances. He lives in Brooklyn with the actress Linda Jones and their dog Coraline. So for more information, please visit www.johnfoster.com. Welcome to John, and we're also here with Nicholas Kaufmann. Nicholas Kaufmann is the author of 6 novels of horror, dark fantasy, and adventure. The latest, which is the best-selling horror novel, 100 Fathoms Below, co-authored with Stephen L. Kent. His work has been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, the Thriller Award, and the Dragon Award. His fiction has appeared in Cemetery Dance, Black Static, Nightmare Magazine, Interzone, and many others. In addition to his own original work, He has written for such properties as Zombies versus Robots, The Rocketeer, and Warhammer. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. How are you doing this Christmas Eve, guys?
Wonderful.
Great. I didn't realize you've got a Brooklyn theme going tonight.
That's right.
Yeah. I am not in Brooklyn, but I was born and raised in Brooklyn. So
honorary. You're honorary Brooklyn tonight.
That's right. Close enough.
Honorary Brooklyn. We're putting the New York in the New York Ghost Story Festival. What do you guys normally do on Christmas Eve? How about you, Nick? Where are you usually on Christmas Eve?
Like many Jewish New Yorkers, I'm usually having Chinese food and watching a movie.
How about I like to do that. I like to do that. I mean,
nothing wrong with it.
What's that?
I said nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, nothing wrong with it. Yeah, I feel like I can still. I wasn't on the ball. If I had my act together, I could have gotten some Chinese food and brought it over to the other room. But just not the same. But you know what? I'm not complaining. There's no complaints this year. What about you, John? What's Christmas Eve usually look like for you?
Well, this year we're actually doing what Nick normally does. Linda's out getting Chinese food right now, and then we're going to watch a movie after we're done reading. But in the past, what we've done is we sort of do a special night where we go to Marie's Cheese, and we get all sorts of expensive cheeses and charcuterie and drink too much wine and just make a night of it, often with just a friend or two, like a small little group. And that's been our Christmas Eve. But this year is 2020, so we're staying in and having Chinese.
Nice. All of that sounds nice and as good as can be. Just relaying the welcome from the people who've joined us in the chat room, are saying nice things about your work, saying hello to you, saying hello to us. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
We'll talk with John first. Nick, feel free to jump in on any of these questions. But I know, John, I know you're a fan of classic ghost stories, and
yes.
when I started getting into them, you were one of the first people I asked about, and you lent me some books, and were a big help in getting me up to speed with the classics here. What's the appeal of the ghost story to you as a reader?
Horror comes in so many different flavors. But the ghost story is one of the first kinds of horror stories that I encountered, and still is very frightening to me. It's redolent with sort of the atmosphere and the trappings of horror. Chandeliers with flickering candles and creaking floorboards and all that sort of thing. And I just eat that stuff up. And with regard to Christmas Eve and why these stories work so well on Christmas Eve, unlike some other types of stories, I think that classic ghost stories, they are often written with sort of a macabre glee, and they're not necessarily as savage as some other kinds of horror stories, or maybe instilling dread in the same way. And so I just find them, there's something fun about the way that they scare you versus other kinds of horror.
I'm glad. There's a lot of great things you mentioned in there. I'm glad you mentioned atmosphere, because it's so counterintuitive. I'm setting an atmosphere, the most, if not the most important. That's like the way I go into a story. And in my initial preparations for this festival, I wasn't thinking about atmosphere as the component of the ghost story. I guess because it was so close to me and so evident that I don't know. I just didn't have my questions about it. But so many of the guests were mentioning when I was like, "What does a ghost story mean to you?" Just as you mentioned, atmosphere. And while a ghost story can be about and can do so many other things, I think just like in fiction, if fiction isn't fun, you don't get to go to the other places. Like, at least for me, if a story isn't fun, if it's not engaging me, if it's not entertaining me, I don't care how important it is. I don't care what else it's doing. What is it about? What is it about the form of the ghost story, John, that is so timeless? Like, why has it lasted so long, do you think?
Oh, I think our inability to understand what happens after death, has been with us since, we attained consciousness. So unlike other boogeymen, etc., or legends. This runs through all cultures, and none of us have a full grasp on it. And so it's a mystery that we can plumb endlessly, and come up with all kinds of permutations. And it strikes directly at our own mortality. So I think that is always just a chilling reminder that we will one day, shrug off this mortal coil. So I don't think that's ever going to go out of style.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned death and fear of death. A ghost story that you mentioned in our preparations for this is by Ambrose Bierce, The Moonlit Road, which features some interesting portrayals of life after death. I'm going to have to step away from the camera for a second for a tech issue, but I'll be back momentarily. But if you could tell us, I hope the sound of my alarm system going off isn't bleeding into here, but I'm going to fix that. And if you could tell our listeners a bit about The Moonlit Road and why it's one of your favorites.
Well, this is The Moonlit Road, and I'll be reading from this book tonight, though not this story, but it's one of Bierce's better known stories. Bierce was a writer in the early 20th century. He died late 19th, early 20th century. He died, I want to say, 1912, something like that. But The Moonlit Road is a classic. It gives you jealousy, murder, mistaken identity, madness, and a ghost. And the story is told from several different perspectives, including a person who was terrified and by the ghost, by the apparition, a person who committed the murder, and also from the point of view of the ghost herself. So it's a ton of fun, and the way it's structured, in sort of a Rashomon kind of fashion. You have the event, but then you have the perspective of these different people and ghosts on what happened exactly during the event.
Yeah, it's a super fun one. I have it in this book, The World's Favorite Ghost Story. So it's right up there. It's highly anthologized. Yeah, of course, I always mispronounce names and words, but it's told. I believe it's told from epistolary. Like it's the writings, it's the written accounts of the first two people, and then the third one is the written account of Madame through a medium. Like that whole third part of the story is the woman telling it from beyond the grave. And yeah, on the surface level, that's just plain fun. And putting it, I think it was first published in 1907, or like right around the turn of the century. One of the things I think about when revisiting these stories is just the context of where they were when they were published. I wonder, like, it's I guess yesterday's classics, or yesterday's progressives are today's classics. Like I imagine that story was perhaps just in its structure, which seems so elegant and simple and classic right now, was probably a big deal back then. Of like, wow, it looks like a ghost story, and it is a ghost story with all the trappings, the atmosphere, the mystery of it. But you get like the whole third part. You get it from the other different perspectives, almost like a Quentin Tarantino plays with perspective in his film. And it's as far from a Tarantino tone as can be, but at least in that structure wise there.
Well, and what he does, that we think of when we think of M.R. James, who's sort of the godfather of the classic ghost story, is that twist at the end. And I think, because of people like M. Night Shyamalan and stuff like that, maybe people have a bad taste in their mouth when you hear about a twist. But these writers deliver it with such skill, and it's always surprising. And so I've loved to help myself, not just for pleasure reading, but to help myself learn how to deliver those surprises, studying Bierce and James and writers like that, to see how they set it up. And it's just so wonderfully done. And even though the writing in a lot of these older stories it is of its time, so it's a little. It tends to be a little more ponderous than a lot of present day writing, just in structure. But man, they just it's like Zorro stabbing you with his sword. They just stick that surprise in brilliantly, and Bierce does that very well.
I think it's a great point. I'm glad that you mentioned that. Right, with the advent of the water cooler moment, and perhaps with lesser hands or script by by committee of trying to deliver that water cooler moment or trying to deliver that twist. Yeah, there is a little bit of a backlash on the twist, but if you get beyond that, readers, people who I talk to who are just readers, who are just watchers of film, that twist is really important. That's something, subverting expectations, or just delivering something fun, just delivering something you hadn't thought of, is a big part of why people are entertained by media. And yeah, sometimes we might forget that, or just to go back to the basics and just be like, why are these fun? Why are they operating that way? Speaking of fun, before we move on to a fun reading that you're going to do for us, do you have an indie bookstore or something local that you can recommend for us, John?
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to two, actually. One is in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint section of Brooklyn, and that's Word Bookstore. It's a great bookstore, and I first went there to see Laird Barron do a Halloween reading, and they have a fantastic space for readings downstairs in a basement that feels like it's a cave. So anyway, it's a great store to visit, and I would encourage people to go. And then there's a small chain of used bookstores in New England, Annie's Bookstop, and there are several of them. In Massachusetts, there's one in Nashua, New Hampshire, and you can walk in there with just a couple of bucks and walk out with several paperbacks. And the one in Nashua in particular had a great horror section, a great science fiction and fantasy section, and I used to visit it all the time when I'd be visiting my folks who lived in New Hampshire. So Word Bookstore in Brooklyn and Annie's Bookstop. There are several in New England.
John, you're going to be reading from Ambrose Bierce, The Boarded Window, and you're also going to read a bit from The 12 Terrors of Christmas by John Updike and Edward Gorey. Which one are you going to read from first?
I'm going to read from Ambrose Bierce first. And okay. I've redacted the opening just a teeny bit for time, but I am going to jump right in, if that's okay.
Okay, let's take it away, John, and we'll see you on the other side of that.
The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today, who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles, which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure, he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day, Murlock was found in his cabin dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told, and should remember. I only know that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit.
Oh, looks like oh, John, you had a little bit of technical problems.
Okay.
But you're back with us. Take it. Last line I heard was with a willing spirit. So we're going to go back to you. Take it away. With a willing spirit.
With a willing spirit and light heart, there is no known record of her name, of her charms of mind and person. Tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt. But God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness, there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life. For what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day, Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health. But at the end of the third day, she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away, apparently, with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others, which he did correctly, were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow, he said aloud, I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her when she is no longer in sight. But now she is dead, of course. But it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to keener life, to another as the blow of a bludgeon, which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long, wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening wood. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded the unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream, for Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened. He knew not why. There, in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see he knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath was suspended, his blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step, another, sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in darkness through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless. His arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him. And at the same instant, he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall with a little groping, seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman towards the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there were darkness blacker than before, and silence. And when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, and the long hair in disorder. The limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear.
Wow, great job.
Thank you.
Great job. Nick is clapping for you. Wow. So many of my favorite stories have big cats and panthers in them. So great to see that. You're gonna give us some of the 12 terrors of Christmas. Not all 12. Some of them from John Updike and Edward Gorey.
Yes, I thought I'd just share these just because they're fun. They're not necessarily scary. They're just very strange, and I'm a huge Edward Gorey fan.
And you've been practicing holding them up for the camera to share the Gorey illustrations.
And you can see how skilled I am when I held up the cover. So here is the first one.
All right.
And it's O Tannenbaum. Suppose it topples over under its weight of bomb-shaped baubles. Suppose it harbors wood borers which will migrate to the furniture. There is something ghastly about a tree. Its look of many-limbed paralysis, its shaggy and conscienceless aplomb, encountered in the open, let alone in the living room. At night, you can hear it rustling and slurping water out of the bucket.
All right, hold that one up for a second there. I'm doing the old-fashioned. If you could hold it up one more time to the camera, John. I'm doing the great old-fashioned high-tech way of taking pictures with the cell phone instead of screenshotting. Great, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, this next one is called Tiny Reindeer. Hooves that cut through roof shingles like linoleum knives. Unstable flight patterns suggesting to at least one observer dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly. Fur possibly laden with disease-bearing ticks. We'll do one more. The Dark.
Thanks for holding up those Edward Gorey illustrations, and we're all snapping like beatniks for your little readings here.
Oh, how early it comes now! How creepy and green in the gills everyone looks, scrabbling along the drab winter wraps by the phosphorus light of department store windows full of styrofoam snow, mock-ups of a facetious 1890, and beige mannequins posed with false jauntiness in plaid bathrobes. Is this hell, or just an upturn in consumer confidence? Anyway, I thought those were amusing.
That was great.
Thanks.
Great job. Fun stuff. Full of atmosphere.
And consumer confidence.
Yes.
Nick, before I'm gonna read something with a little bit of atmosphere, but what's the importance of atmosphere to you in a ghost story? Why do you feel that people keep coming back for that ghostly atmosphere?
Well, atmosphere in any genre of fiction sets the tone, which is why it's so important in horror in particular, and ghost stories as well, because ghost stories are very much about sort of the thinning of the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Um, and to be honest, I mean, some people look at ghost stories in a very sort of positive light. They think, well, this is proof then of existence beyond death, right? So even if the story might be a little spooky, there's something really nice here happening. It was showing us that there is existence beyond death. And maybe it's just me, but I actually take sort of an opposite view of that, because what ghost stories are showing us is that even beyond death, our problems follow us. Our emotional issues follow us. Our unfinished business follows us. There is no rest after death. We're still here. We're still trying to figure shit out. Excuse my language. So uh, all of that is meaningless in my opinion without the proper atmosphere, because atmosphere is really what gets under the skin of the reader. You know, it's what lingers in a horror story is very much the atmosphere.
You just went from Christmas comfort food to being like, yes, these comforting tales show us how lovely that there is something more. However, that something more is meaninless. Q. Aikman, welcome to the void.
Well, I don't mean to throw cold water on the festivities, but ghosts are bringing their own emotions and their own problems with them. And that really does speak to like what happens when we die. Do we really have to bring all this baggage with us? I thought it would be a relief.
It's a great question.
This is my Jewish ghost, I guess. I thought it would be a relief.
It's a great, no matter which way you fall on it, or if you fall on neither side, it is a great spin on what that atmosphere means to us.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be spooky castles and mist and candelabras, right? You can have an atmosphere of pervasive dread, or an atmosphere of just sort of that's oppressive, right? And that can, you know, as I said before, really get under the reader's skin and make it last for them.
I did pick a story that I'm about to read from. This is Ghosteria Volume 1 by Tanith Lee. And as I was talking to you guys off camera before, there's just so many Tanith Lee stories. I didn't even realize that there was a whole book of ghost stories by Tanith Lee. Nick, you pointed out so many different things that the ghost story can do, and so many different atmospheres. I chose this one that I'm about to read for its winter, if not Christmas, for its wintry atmosphere. So I'll see you on the other side of this reading. I'm going to be reading a story from Tanith Lee after I adjust our mics. Okay. This is The Winter Ghosts by Tanith Lee. Winter is a ghost that haunts the world. You know it by gray transparencies, its crystalline white comings and goings. In the winter, to the town about some business for my father, and was told I must call in on my aunt. I resisted. She has been good to you, young man, they said. She has paid for my education and other things. My life was full of obligations, it seemed to me, and nowhere was I free to do what I wanted. I had been the slave of my school, and now was my father's, working in his shop, where I did not want to be, and trapped in the village of my birth. I had seen and done nothing, but there again, what would I have chosen to do? I have no great driving talents. I like to read and to lie abed, for either of which occupations there was now slight time. Every day I was up at dawn, for on Sunday I must go to church to show my respect to God. At night I ate my supper and fell between my sheets, exhausted. What a life! The town and the prospect of visiting it had cheered me a little, despite the winter road and the stubborn old horse. The wayside packed by forest, starving beggars who seemed to signal from every glassy bush, according to rumor, and the first wave of wolves that I hated and feared along with everyone else. But now my sojourn in the town was to be divided between my father's commission and my aunt's fancy. It was decided I was not to stay overnight at the inn, but at my aunt's house. My heart sank into the floor. It stayed there, and I left it behind. The ride was not too bad. A faint flurry of snow disturbed the horse, who for a mile kept stopping and shaking his head distractedly. I saw no beggars and no wolves, though once I heard one howling. I arrived at the town gates before the sun set on a gray, thick sky. I should proceed at once to the aunt's attending my father's wants in the morning. I had not seen either the town or the aunt since childhood. Both had been different then, more interesting to me. I had half anticipated some sense of purpose or festivity in the town, and there was none I could perceive. The shops blinkered, the populace running homeward before the cold, hardly a soul on the streets. The inn looked welcoming with its gold and red sign, but now I was not getting there. What did I remember of the aunt? She had been slender and excitable, with a high, hot color in her cheeks. Her dark hair was drawn up with combs and curled. She wore a dark red gown and was dancing, for it had been a festival, hence my anticipations, memories of the town. As a child, I had liked her, but she had paid me very slight attention. Her own father was alive then, and had she not been engaged to be married? There was some tragedy or scandal never spoken of to me. Her money had come to her with the town house at my grandfather's death. My father benefited in other ways. My aunt was then alone in the world, having no one on whom to squander the excess of her small riches. She made provision for me and my two sisters. In me, a less grateful wretch she could not have hoped to find. Far better I had liked the little drummer doll with bells, the first gift she gave me indifferently at the festival. That was 15 years ago. She would be old now, for she was not young then. Her high, just black trees, already edged with snow, occluded its walls. The shutters were fastened, and not a light showed. The house might have been deserted, the impression it gave. I dismounted, secured my horse, and tried the cumbersome knocker. I had knocked some 6 or 7 times before I got any answer, and then, to my surprise, it was the aunt who came to the door and opened it. Old Ermine died, said she, standing in the dim hall, which just barely fluttered at her lamp. Now I'm my old maid, my own housekeeper, too. You mustn't expect too much, she added, as if we had been speaking for an hour. It seemed she knew me, for who else but the looked-for nephew would call on her? Nevertheless, I introduced myself politely, and then she extended her dry, powdered cheek for my kiss. She was indeed as aged as I had feared, a skinny old woman in a wrinkled reddish dress, with ear-drops full of dull pearl, which perhaps she had put on to honor my advent. She wore no rings, but her hands had been mutilated by rheumatism. She led me in. It transpired there was still an antiquated man, Pears, she called him, who would see to my horse, as he saw to the fire in the parlor and other manly work. I caught glimpse of him, about 100 he looked, but the horse was getting on too. They would be patient with each other. The parlor was like home, crowded by slabs of the furniture, which was all I knew, and that spelled affluence and entrapment, had I given them names. Crystal and china, perhaps never used, bulged upon a wooden mountain, dully catching the firelight through their dust. The fire was a poor one. What else could you expect of Paris? Will you take some tea? I doubted there was a drop of spirit in the house, and felt a very real and unjust anger at her, my aunt, forcing me here to this cage, uncomfortably, not equipped to please me in the least. We had tea, some thin jam, and she told me I should not smoke, not in the rooms. I had guessed and not tried. Truth to tell, I was not much of a smoker, though it was expected in a man, a sort of condoned vice. But now it was night, these unshuttered back windows very black beyond the rusty curtains. In the town, a few panes were alight, but they looked dim and parsimonious. My aunt had lit 2 lamps. These windows of hers would have that look. I forget properly what we spoke of. There were long silences. What could she expect? She asked me of my work, which I disliked, of my school, which she had provided, and I hated. She asked of my uninteresting family and my sisters, one of whom was now married to a fat bumpkin, very suitable to her. Finally, in a sort of sneering pity, I said, I remember you dancing in a red dress. You gave me a doll with bells. I was very young. Ah, that was another time, she added obscurely. Another woman. Later, we went into the dining room, and I had my first shock. The long old table was hung with a lace cloth over mulberry velvet, meticulously laid with china and a silver service. There were 10 places, each fully set. I thought we dined alone, Aunt. I never dine alone. But then again, you will see no one besides me, of course. I see them all, of course, in my imagination. You understand. Pears brought in the dishes. There were only 3. They had come from an obliging cook shop, heated up in the kitchen below, but not sufficiently. Water was served with the meal, very proper. I was interested to see Pears pass every plate from the 8 other settings. Onto each was placed by my aunt a tiny portion of the frugal meal. Pears filled each goblet from the water jug. I looked on and tried to picture ghostly fingers raising the glasses, invisible hands plying the knives and forks. Pears left us. Who is here, Aunt? Won't you tell me? I inquired, because I was so very bored. A leadenness had stayed with me, compounded of snow, tiredness, inertia. Besides, how could her secret guest be paraded them? People of my past. Is grandfather there? Grandfather? Of course, it is a family table. He is at the table's head. Your fiance, too? But she lowered her scaly eyes and would not answer. I had been indecorous, probably. Why did you never marry, Aunt? I demanded brutally. It was a long time ago. I recall everything well. I recall the man, I did not, dancing with you downstairs. No, no, she said. But I was irked enough I did not allow her any rights to pain. She had interfered in my life, it seemed to me, and made things worse. She had forced me here when I might have drunk brandy at the inn. Surely you can tell me. I've only heard stories of it. What stories? That he jilted you, left you almost at the altar. Here's my commentary. This guy's a jerk. But back to the story. Oh, the liars. Who said this? She was inflamed now, surprising me a little. The servants. An old nurse. I had. None of it is true. He died. He wasn't young. His health wasn't good. The excitement. He took a chill and was dead in a week. There was the longest silence yet. But you see him here tonight. I even shocked myself at my grossness. Perhaps the water had made me drunk. I was used to a glass of wine at home. At last she spoke to me. Yes, I see them all. I invite them here. Why shouldn't you know? My father, my betrothed, my mother takes her place, and my mother's 2 sisters. Then there's my girlhood friend I see there. She died so young. She is the youngest among us. And there is my tutor, whom I feared and loved, and who darts me terrible stern glances because he thinks I've forgotten my lessons. And he's right in that, for I have. And old Ermine is with us too now. I included her a month after her death, for she required her rest before that. A nasty but interesting idea came over me that I could see them after all. The grandfather, as I recalled him, with his fob watch and high collar, the invented mother I had never myself witnessed, and her aged crone sisters in their black and lace and old-fashioned hair. The young friend caught fast forever. Perhaps she did not mind. I put her in an antique gown. The mature bridegroom coughing a touch at his handkerchief. The elderly tutor, and old Ermine, who once or twice I had really seen, for she had been mercilessly sent to the village on my aunt's errands when only a trace younger. I guessed Ermine was content to sit at last at her mistress's table, even to the tepid meat and water. Pray don't let me prevent you, I said, conversing with them all, if that's how you usually go on. You think me very eccentric, said my aunt, but these who are dear to me, those for whom I have a responsibility, what else should I do? And she had put me through school just so she kept these by her, these withered flowers, her ghostly dinner guests. Forever? Or until her death? And why not? Maybe beyond her death they would sit nightly at this drab table, eat the unpalatable food. I was becoming as foolish as she. Well, you must do as you think fit, aunt. And now I thank you for this meal, but ask you to excuse me if I go presently to bed. The long ride tired me greatly. I'm up so early and must be off early tomorrow, I fear, on my father's commission. She was startled a moment, then she settled down. The old are early to bed also, she told me. She did not keep late hours, but I must take a cup of tea with her in the parlor to cheer me for my couch. Out of the kindness of my unkind heart, I consented. I spent one further hour with her before escaping to the dusty, dark room aloft. There in the great bed, by the poor light of one thin candle, I had meant to read a smuggled book. But my own bane of tiredness came in on me. Soon the lines swam, and I blew out the candle and yawned myself to oblivion. There I dreamed of being a prisoner in my aunt's house. I could not get out, and was in the act of bribing Purrs to open a tiny door in the cellar for me. I think it did not in real life exist. When I woke, it was a milky dawn and the fine snow blowing, and I had my father's business to transact before I could start out on my ride home. My aunt was not yet risen, so I left my message of gratitude and farewell with Purrs. The business took up half the morning, and when it was done, I gathered myself to the inn, and there, on top of the bread and stale tea of my hasty breakfast, I put in 3 brandies against the rigors of the ride home, with which, truth to tell, I was now dreading. I had a sort of presentiment of ill luck, which drinking the brandy, rather than dispel it, had brought closer. Shortly after midday, though it looked more like dusk, I left the town and the old staid horse, and I went down the road and in along the great strands of the forest. The snow had stopped, and a freezing was coming on. You felt it approach like a stealthy noise. Now and then a branch cracked in the forest at the cold, but there was no other sound, save for the plodding of the horse. A faint smoke hung once in the distance from some charcoal burners. Otherwise, there was no hint of any human creature. I might have been alone in the woods at the world's edge out of a legend. And this thought oppressed me, even as I began to have quite incompatible fear of robbers. Robbers there were, but not of the mortal type. About an hour after I got beyond the town, when my home in my father's house, so despised, had begun to seem to me the dearest place on earth, a small pack of wolves started to follow me. Despite all that is said and agreed on wolves, they are, in fact, not so much of a foe to a mounted man, but I feared them and disliked them in company with anyone I could think of. My childhood had been spiced by the tales of other children the wolves had carried off and eaten, and only a dead wolf was a pleasure to me to see, as I had occasionally had. Their eyes were the worst, for their shapes, loping along and a few yards behind me, they were almost lost in the trees. But out of the afternoon dusk, now and then one would come a green flash, or I would see an actual eye fastened on me with a malevolent, unique intensity. I tried a sharp shout or two, which gave them doubts, but then on they loped again. I was the only moving thing of any size for miles. They were curious and they were hungry. How I longed for a joint of raw meat I might have bought and thrown to them. How I longed to have drunk more or less, or that the old horse might have been pricked to a gallop. But my attempts to hurry him presently confused him. He did not like the wolves either, but was inclined more to congeal, to stasis and shiver than to hasten off. Perhaps they would get tired of me and let me be. They did not. About mid-afternoon, when I had been followed a good hour, the old horse managed a brief canter, hit us into a low-slung bough that brought snow down on me, and stumbled. Between the bough and the stumble, I went out of the saddle and slithered to the ground. As I lay there stunned, the horse, relieved of my slowing weight, gave a bright whinny and fled along the road. I sat up before I was ready and my head rang. Then I tried to get to my feet and slipped full length again. And then the wolves, there were 5 of them, came out of the trees and onto the road. They stood looking at me, and vividly do I recollect their lean, black shapes against the snow, each one exactly resembling the model of the others, as if it had all been cast from a single mold of wickedness. Their eyes were like the eyes of cruel men, intent and hypnotic, yellow as flames. Was any one less than the others? An entity they were, one thing, and all gazing upon me. I despaired. In that moment, I imagined myself at the gate of death, and this is what I saw. First, the terrible, rending agony of being eaten alive, and then the mildewed pit of the dead from which a faint, drear voice was calling me. Come, dear nephew, it said, sit down, I've laid a place for you. And out of the teeth of the wolves and shadows of the grave, I emerged into that cold dining room with its table of mulberry and lace, and sat myself before a setting of dusty china and silver. To my right was an ugly young girl in an outdated gown, and to my left was a balding scholar in a shabby coat. All around were old ladies with piled up fake curls and a coughing man, not me, of 60, and my grandfather consulting his watch, for I had come late and kept them waiting. And there, opposite his place, sat my aunt in her red dress and eardrops, nodding and smiling at me as she helped me to a bauble of cold steamed food, and purrs filled my glass with water. No, I cried, you shan't. And I flung myself forward at the wolves. I was shouting and roaring, and out of my pocket I had taken my wooden matches, which I struck in panic and nearly set myself alight. Perhaps it was those brief gusts of fire, or the awful noises I made, and which I myself heard as if from a great distance. But the foremost wolf backed off. As I rushed screaming down at him, all 5 darted into the bushes and suddenly away. For some minutes, I remained yelling and stamping, jumping up and down in the snow. White burnt matches struck up to my burnt fingers and the hole I had fired in my sleeve. I recalled, I howled, I would not go. I would not be caught forever, for eternity in that smothering. No, not I. When I came back to my wits, no hint of the wolves lingered. A vast emptiness was there, and I was blazing hot inside the great orb of the cold. I went down the road for something to do and found the horse loitering at the wayside a quarter-mile off. I mounted him in silence, and he walked on. Who would believe me? I've heard since of men frightening off wolf packs with loud cries and curious behavior, but that was in other lands and at another time. For then I knew only I had not been brave and had best keep quiet. More than their eyes and teeth I had feared the dinner table of my aunt, and I did not want to be another of her winter ghosts. It was that cowardice which made me turn against the wolves, and 7 months later, the same cowardice which made me run away for good to another, less safe, stranger, and more ordinary life. So that was the Winter Ghosts by Tanith Lee. That appeared in the winter of 1991-92 issue of Weird Tales.
I think we can all relate to not wanting to hang out with our family like that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, it was like a very timely, very timely.
Stay with the aunt you don't know, not
Yeah.
the inn where you can drink. No, thank you.
Oh, I have to have dinner with
Yeah,
my
I
aunt.
forgot
I'd rather fight these wolves.
I basically always try to just stay at a hotel,
Yeah,
no
I
matter
thought I
what
was
the
choosing it for
offering
the
is.
atmosphere, but I guess it was Tanith Lee telling us to stay away from toxic family for all.
Right.
No, I like the atmosphere very much
It
of
was
that.
very
It felt
wintry.
very wintry.
Yeah, I mean that's the great thing of being a Tanith Lee fan is that I very well might go to my grave before reading the Tanith Lee, even in the book I collect. I've not read her, so that was a new me Tanith Lee story. We're going to move on to Nick in just a moment. A couple of mentions I just want to do before we do that. This stream of tonight's event is going to remain up here as an archive. All 6 nights of the festival dates will be up there, are up there, and you can watch them at your leisure. You can come back to the channel. So hit subscribe to the YouTube channel if that's your thing. You can stay in touch there. Also on the channel are other events such as the book launch of Underworld Dreams, which our guest Nick Kaufmann joined me in conversation about the book Underworld Dreams. You can see that there. And also moving ahead into 2021, all Nighttime Logic events will be on this channel as well. If you'd like to support the festival, you can donate to our Ko-Fi account, which is ko-fi.com/Nighttime Logic. You can support me by checking out my latest book, Underworld Dreams. Underworld Dreams and all of my books do have ghosts and ghost stories in them. And also, please do consider checking out the indie bookstores that we mentioned. So next up, we're going to talk with Nick Kaufmann. Nick, what's the appeal in general to you as a reader of the ghost story? What's the appeal to you?
Well, one of the things that I really like about narrative, whether it's horror or any genre, is the journey of discovery and the revelation at the end of what's really happening or what has been happening behind the scenes. It's why I like mysteries so much, and it's why I like twisty thrillers so much. And I do believe that at heart, most ghost stories are mysteries. Not all of them, certainly. I would say actually the greatest ghost story of all, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, is not a mystery. We never really find out what happened in that house to make it so bad. It's all left unsolved. But at heart, most of them are mysteries. And there is that moment at the end of revelation of who the ghost is, why there is a ghost, and the fate that will befall those who encounter the ghost. And I love that. I love that stuff. It's why I'm so dumb about or not dumb, mean about spoilers online, because I enjoy the journey of discovery the most. And with ghost stories, I mean it's built in, right? You've got a dead person. How did they die? What did they want? Can I help them? And I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Well, you touched on perhaps the greatest, most awful category of horror in all of the genre, which is the online unsuspected spoiler. I mean, please, this is a family show, Nick. Please do
My
not go there.
apologies. I won't apologize for saying that the afterlife is as terrible as life, but I will apologize for using spoilers.
Please, you and Robert Aikman owe me an apology for telling me that beneath this mask of comfort is the void. How dare you two? But you mentioned in your description of what you like about ghost stories, you mentioned two different kinds of ghost stories. Like there's the mystery, and then there's you said the not a mystery, and right, like there's just two different. There's so many different kinds, but yeah, there's the joy. If I dare say it, more of a classic format. Okay, yeah, there's the mystery, and then there's the joy of the revelation, and right, maybe that's more classic. You pointed out that's one of the things that we love about fiction is the journey of discovery. You said it really well, and then there's the other side of it. And at first, I was going to say the stories like Shirley Jackson and Robert Aikman, those kind of stories where we never know it, and the journey, the joy is something else. And at first, I was going to put out there, okay, that's classic and modern, but even Dickens did both. Even the classic people did both. They even the classics give us that journey of discovery when they reveal it, but even these early ghost story authors were giving us the weird, we're giving us the strange, we're giving us the unexplained.
Yeah, I'm sure I didn't get to see all of the nights you did, but I'm sure one of your authors must have talked about Dickens' The Signal Man.
Yes,
which
that's
is
exactly
a classic, wonderful, horrible ghost story about the inevitability, right? Like you can't escape your fate. Where the ghost is a ghost of the future, not the past.
Yeah, I believe it was. We didn't read from it, but our guest Farrah Rose Smith was talking. She read from some Kafka. She was talking about existentialism, and she pointed out in the festival, right, of how right in some ghost stories we have the phantom, and the phantom is a warning. The phantom wants to tell us, such as in the Rudyard Kipling, where the body is buried. But in the Signal Man, it's like, nope.
No, this is your fate, and you are doomed to it.
Yeah, phantoms are meaningless, and heed the warning or not. This is your fate. And
well, that's
right,
the thing, right? In that story, the signalman does heed the warning. He's like, "What is this phantom trying to tell me?" And he still can't do anything.
Right. And it's the opposite of the story that you're going to read from us in just a bit. We get not one of my favorite ghost story. We're going to hear from A Christmas Carol, which is the ultimate in ghosts coming from warning. We have an MC ghost who is going to be your host and brings on an all-star cadre of three other ghosts, three of the most simple and elegant
it's
and
really
interesting ghosts.
It's a ghost review, right? I mean, it's like a ghost gong show.
Yeah.
It's like we've got the host, and then you bring on the acts.
And yeah, it's a ghost story where old Scrooge heeds the warning, and it's a happy ending. And I'm one who, I don't like my happy endings, and I don't like my stories wrapped up in a bow. But when you do it as elegantly and as effectively as Charles Dickens does in A Christmas Carol, I can't help but love it every time. Yeah, well, ghost stories. Even John mentioned. I was going to ask you what's the appeal of them across cultures, but John had answered that. If you want to tell us, what's the appeal of ghost stories across cultures? And I know you've written your share of ghost stories. One of them was in your short story collection, Still Life 9 Stories, which is a version your take on a classic Japanese folktale, which is something we didn't talk too much about in this year's of the festival. I didn't get too many non-Anglo-centric stories, but you want to tell us a little bit about your story and your take on that Japanese ghost story?
Yeah, sure. It's actually the story of Hoichi, which is a really well-known Japanese folktale. Although I first discovered it in a book called Kwaidan by Lafcadio Hearn, which I studied in college in my favorite class. It was a class on folktales, and I loved it. But so if you don't know the story, Hoichi is a blind musician who's so good at playing the biwa that he is summoned by a samurai to play for the spirit of Emperor Antoku. Although being blind, he doesn't know that he's playing for a ghost. But a friend of his who's a priest, discovers the secret and tries to protect Hoichi by painting his body with sacred kanji to make him invisible. So the next day, the samurai returns to bring him back for an encore performance, but he can't see Hoichi because of the kanji. However, unfortunately, the priest sort of forgot to paint kanji on Hoichi's ears, so they're the only part that's visible to the samurai. So as you can imagine, he walks into the room looking for Hoichi, and he just sees these two ears floating in the air. So what he does is he rips the ears off of Hoichi's head to bring as evidence to the emperor that this was the only part of Hoichi he could find, because he doesn't want to get in trouble. So the story that I wrote is called Fearless, which is sort of a play on the word earless for Hoichi. And it's sort of a modern day riff on Hoichi, but it's about a Japanese filmmaker who is adapting a famous manga, but changes everything good about it to appeal to the American audience, who are ravenous for J-horror movies about long-haired ghost girls, none of which appear in the original manga. So the author of the manga is very sensitive about this, and he kills himself, and then haunts the filmmaker, who then has protective kanji written on his body by the manga's artist. But the same issues occur for him that occurred for Hoichi, namely his ears remain unprotected, and it's through his ears that the author's ghost has, eventually has his revenge. So obviously it's a little bit dated now. I wrote this one quite a while ago. It's a little bit dated now because J-horror is no longer as popular as it once was.
But it's still a thing, and it's still I think it has its level of popularity. I mean, I'm stuck on the image of floating ears, which is just such it's such
right off.
It just tears him out. He's like, I can't find the guy, but these ears will do.
It's such a Japanese, and what I mean by that, they just have such wonderfully unsettling, strange images, and they're just not afraid to deliver it. Floating ears, floating heads, disembodied.
3 or 4 of the stories from Kwaidan were made into a film by the same name, Kwaidan, and it's spectacular. If you have, it's like 3 hours long, but it's so beautiful, and it's just, the stories are so wonderful and so spooky, and most of them are actually ghost stories. I highly recommend it.
I look forward to checking it out. And you mentioned that you studied in college, and if I'm not mistaken, I am the proud beneficiary of your college book. I think you updated your copy, and a few years ago, you gave me an old copy of Kwaidan, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yes, I found a really beautifully illustrated copy. So I gave you the old Tuttle edition that I had from college.
Yeah. So as I was putting for this event, I was putting together all my ghost stories, or attempting to make a ghost story shelf. I remember that. So thank you so much for that. Let's talk about another weird story. When we were preparing for the event, one of the stories we contemplated, we were picking stories to read, and I think you were we almost landed on The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford as one. Before we landed on closing out with the great A Christmas Carol. Do you want to tell us a little bit about The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford?
Sure.
I have it here in this little, I think I got this at a Nikon one year, this little 1940s pocket yellowed ghost story book that I just cherish. It's in my pocket book of ghost stories. Tell us about The Upper Berth and the weird ghost that appears in it.
Well, we were talking about that, and as I recall, we got into a little bit of an argument about whether The Upper Berth is actually a ghost story.
Did we argue?
I fell on the side that it was.
What's that?
I fell on the side that it is a ghost story.
I think it is. It is as well. Okay. I mean, maybe not the most Christmasly. Christmas mood, and maybe it's much more on "Welcome to the Void for Christmas" from Nick Kaufmann and Robert Aikman.
So the upper berth. I got a book of F. Marion Crawford stories when I was in probably my late 20s and devoured it. I thought it was great, and the upper berth is the one that stuck with me the most. It's about this guy named Brisbane who is sailing across the Atlantic, and he's given stateroom 105 to sleep in. And of course, there's all sorts of murmurs and whispers about stateroom 105. But so basically, it's got a bunk bed with an upper and lower berth. Brisbane takes the lower berth, and some unnamed roommate takes the upper. And in the middle of the night, his roommate flees in terror and throws himself overboard.
Never a good sign.
Not a good sign. And like the room becomes damp and cold and smells of seawater. So he starts talking to the crew the next day, and he learns, obviously, that the room is haunted. No one can ever stay the whole night in the upper berth, and the porthole in the wall of the room keeps opening, like it can never stay closed at night. It opens on its own, and you can't even force it closed. And at the climax of the story, Brisbane like rips open the curtains of the upper berth, and he finds he's a form in there that he starts struggling with in the dark. That's in the upper berth, and it feels like a man, but it's icy cold and it's wet. And when he sees it, it's described as, I actually wrote this bit down. It's described as a putrid, oozy thing with dead white eyes, like the corpse of a drowned man.
Lovely.
Yeah, no, it's really the feel-good story of the year.
Like an M.R. James kind of beastie, or I think that's where I got stuck. And if in the course of our discussions I said it wasn't a ghost story, I of course
no, but I don't think you did. I don't think
Philip Van Doren Stern, who, since it is in the pocketbook of ghost stories, who am I to say that? But
it is a ghost story that does not solve its own mystery, right? Like, we don't know who this drowned man is. He's just somebody who continues to return to the room, and there's hints that maybe he threw himself overboard during some older voyage, but we have no idea what's going on. This guy just wants his bed.
It's a wonderfully weird story, and one of those other kinds that you had pointed out, Nick. It's one of those where the mystery is not revealed, which is probably why I wanted to steer us more towards the one that we landed on for tonight, the classic.
This is going to be a big tonal shift from everything I've said before.
Right.
Nothing putrid.
Please exit the void, exit right this way to Santa and feeling good. But before we talk about that one, can you tell us, do you have a local indie bookstore that you can steer us to for people who might want to pick up something that we're talking about?
I do. There is a relatively new indie bookstore in Crown Heights called Café Con Libros, and they had the real misfortune of opening just as the pandemic hit. But they're doing great business. People are doing they're like calling in special orders, and they now have a delivery guy for the neighborhood. So they're doing okay. Like, people are really supporting them. They label themselves as a feminist bookstore, but you can order any book you want from them, and they're pretty great. They're a great bunch of people, and they also sell coffee, which, to be honest, I think is probably half the business they do.
Thank Father Christmas for coffee. Yeah, it sounds great right now. I yearn to be in bookstores. Thanks for pointing out that one, Café Con Libros. I hope to be there with you guys.
It's tiny too. Their space is so small, but they do so much business through email and phone
That's
orders.
great.
No, thanks for pointing that out. So let's talk a bit about A Christmas Carol. What's some of your favorite bits about it, Nick? What do you like about that one?
Well, I think it's certainly famous for its message, right? Of generosity and kindness will lead to a happier life. But what I like most about it is that it just has a really great sense of creative imagination. As an example, let's talk about the ghost of Christmas Past, who in the movies is often either viewed as an old man, portrayed as an old man, or as a woman. But in the book, the Ghost of Christmas Past is a child, but he has white hair and features that are sort of older than a child's. But he also has this blast of light coming out of the top of his head.
Wow.
And a hat that's shaped like a candle snuffer. So when his time is over, when he's done everything he needs to do with Scrooge and he's ready to pass him along to the next spirit, he puts on his hat and snuffs the light, and you think, well, that's it. Like he's snuffing the light, it'll go dark, whatever. But no, he keeps going. He brings the hat down over his entire body and disappears. And that's just so wonderfully imaginative and mirthful that I just think that there's so much great stuff in that book.
And evocative and disturbing and operating as both symbol and literal. They are my favorite gang. They're my favorite ghost gang, bar none.
the Wandering Ghost Review.
I think
what about you, John?
Going back to something that Nick was saying earlier about your life's business not being done. I think Marley's ghost is terrifying in that he's doomed to wander the earth, dragging the chains that he forged in life. What a horrifying future to anticipate.
What an elegant element of just, it's so simple yet so evocative, so perfect that he's dragging those chains.
He's also the only ghost in the book who interacts with Scrooge who is a dead person. The other spirits are of just the divine plane, right?
Yeah, they're more like beings.
Yeah.
Mm.
You could probably write a thesis on that. We don't have time to go into that, but it's just an interesting thing.
I think people have. John, what are some of the other standout, like Marley's Ghost? What else do you dig about A Christmas Carol?
Well, I think talking about happy endings, I think there's something so joyous about Scrooge's turnaround that I find it very infectious. And I've watched several different versions since I was a kid. And I still find it just very magical and sort of the best sort of sense of that term. But at the same time, I think that it's part of what makes it such an exciting story to experience again and again is that the ghosts are threatening. Not only is if Scrooge doesn't turn his life around, he's doomed to wind up like Marley or worse because he's been forging more chains since Marley died. But the ghosts are scary. The Ghost of Christmas Past is creepy and weird. Obviously, the hooded sort of Nazgul, that's the Ghost of Christmas Future, is flat out frightening. My favorite is the Ghost of Christmas Present, which really seems to tie back into the pagan traditions that are interwoven with Christmas and Yule. And a character or a being that, laughs and tells stories and then turns Scrooge's words around on himself and seems to be sitting on top of deep disgust and rage at Scrooge. The Christmas Future isn't really human. Christmas Past is sort of exploring some of what made Scrooge what he is. But Christmas Present is really disgusted by who Scrooge is. And I find that just terrifying and awesome.
And that's sort of the point where we start to see Scrooge turn around, when Christmas Present is like, hey, here's Tiny Tim. You're right. It's so cliche to talk about, but it's not cliche in the presentation where Scrooge starts panicking, where he starts asking the questions that are indicating, like, where he's asking Christmas Present. He's like, is this set in stone, ghost?
Right.
Must this come to pass? Does the child die? And I believe it's Christmas Present. I believe it's Christmas Present. I could be wrong here. Who says, we cannot tell, but I see an empty place at the table, or I see crutches, but I don't see him. Where it's like, it's such a great device. It really just shows the genius of Dickens, where it's showing a chink in Scrooge's icy heart, where he's like, if if I were to change, would it even matter? Right? It's like you were showing him, and is this set in stone? Yeah, so much to love. So John, you're a Ghost of Christmas Present. Is that your favorite of the Ghost Gang?
I think so.
And Nick, yours?
My favorite is Marley, actually.
Marley's Ghost, and I just out of sheer Nazgul imagery, I'm a Ghost of Christmas. I'm a Ghost of Christmas Future. Although I love them, all, and it was fantastic to be reminded of the Ghost of Christmas Past. But John, you mentioned you'd seen so many versions, and we started the night we were just laughing about just how many versions are there of this film. Just the last year around this time, and the other day I was, let me put it on, and I think, no joke, there are at least dozens on the streaming services that I have, all throughout time. I can't even keep track of them. There's just so many. There are just so many versions of them.
Yeah, I mentioned when we were talking earlier before the start that there are articles out there ranking all the different film versions of A Christmas Carol. And the number one version is usually the Alastair Sim one from, I think, 1941. But always in the top 5, always, and this is really interesting, is A Muppet Christmas Carol, which I never thought to explore as an actual adaptation so much as just a Muppet movie.
Where does Scrooge with Bill Murray fall?
That's usually in top 10, definitely. Yeah.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember seeing that one. I remember it being an event, at least when I was a kid, and seeing it. I want to watch. Yeah, after our stream, I am going to search up those articles, and I'm going to, you can watch so many of them. All right, so let's. Nick, what are you going to be? What part are you going to be reading from The Christmas Carol for us?
Well, this is actually still in the first stave of the story, so I'm actually going to be reading the part where he interacts with the ghost of Marley. So he has spent the day at his counting house, which I consider, just from the name counting house, I picture him there just counting money all day. And he's had some dinner in town, and he's come home, and he has seen the face of Marley on the knockers on his front door. And so as he goes inside, he's telling himself it was no big deal, but he's still sort of looking under the bed and in the closet and whatever. And so that's where I'm going to pick up.
All right, so turning it over to Nicholas Kaufmann reading from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Turning it over to you, Nick.
As Scrooge threw his head back in the chair by the fire, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of the grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its head and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, "notwithstanding." "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, to travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chains, and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wear it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. Or would you know, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly, old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed, in business-like manner, though with humility and deference. Slow, the ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and traveling all the time. The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast, said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. Oh, captive, bound, and double-ironed, cried the phantom, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity missed. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. But you are always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business, cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, the spectre said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of my fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, cried the ghost. My time is nearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. How is it I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. That is no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. And that's where I'll leave it.
Brilliant.
After that, he actually looks out the window and sees just a whole smear of ghosts outside floating on the air.
Dan, your mic is off.
Thank you. I forgot which book. I have an illustration of it where it just says the night was filled with phantoms. Maybe
Yes.
I'll be able to.
I decided to stop it when Marley leaves, but there is a little bit left in that particular part of the stave where he looks out the window and he sees all manner of ghosts being held down by their own inefficiencies.
That's the illustration from this one. I think that the caption is the air was filled with phantoms. I was flipping through it as you were reading. I didn't realize that they were in 3.
I don't actually.
They came in 3
Still,
nights.
It's all Christmas Eve, but it's like weird,
version.
like time loopy shit. Excuse my language.
Timey-wimey.
He's
Damn,
amazing.
can Charles
He's
Dickens
absolutely
be
amazing,
any
and I love his
better?
ghosts. I love his non-ghost stories too.
Yeah, that's just like he just. I say it all the time that I don't care about the genre boxes. It's like there's fiction and there's nonfiction, and Dickens just was so organically just was not in boxes. We've got soft time, we've got ghosts, we've got we've just got it. He's just got it all going on. What a great reading, Nick.
Thank
what
you.
A great story,
Thank you.
John. You too. What a great reading. It's been super fun talking about ghost stories. I just want to, before we head toward the end, I just want to join me in thanking. Let's thank everyone from the beginning. Obviously, thanks to everyone who came to spend these dark December nights with us. Thanks so much for making it a great time and making the darkness a little more bearable. And thanks to all of our guests. Thanks to Rudy Dorneman, Gwendolyn Keist, Hyssop Malaro, Lee Thomas, Sarah Langen, Douglas Wynn. We had David Surface and Michelle Garza and Pat Wheel and Joe Kaplan. And we had Jeffrey Ford, Brian Evanson, Liliana Kirsta, James Everington, CC Adams, Farrah Rose Smith, and John Langen. In addition to you guys, Nicholas Kaufmann and John Foster. What a great bunch. What a great festival. I've got a reading list. As if my reading list wasn't already to go in the grave, I'm going to be reading from now until next December to try to process it all. Any highlights of the festival? Anything that stood out for you guys?
I loved what Douglas Wynn read. I'm a big fan of Richard Matheson, and he read a very spooky story. I forgot, The Long Distance Call or something like that.
Yeah.
About it was turned into I think a famous episode of The Twilight Zone as well, but it's about the woman who gets phone calls from a downed line, and it's her husband calling, and it's a wonderful ghost story.
Yeah, and I think the next night, Brian Evanson read Robert Aikman's Your Tiny Hand. I think it was Your Tiny Hand is Frozen. It just reminded me how similar. I guess it's like almost a subgenre of like, not like the call is coming from inside the house. It's like there's a ghost on the other end of the line. There
Yes.
is that that subgenre of stories, and I was unfamiliar with that one, so it was great great to learn of it. And Doug gave a great reading. How about you, John? Anything stands out to you?
Yeah, actually, just the entire concept of the event really was enjoyable and beneficial for me. It's been, like everyone else, locked down through 2020 and all that. I found it difficult to participate online in events, and it's just made me feel like I'm missing more than usual, like going to Fantastic Fiction or something like that at KGB Bar. But joining in to watch these Christmas ghost stories sort of helped pull me out of that sort of static position and engage me, with sort of the December holiday, which I love the December holidays. I just think it's such a warm time, and I love the tradition of ghost stories. So just having the entire experience really sort of pulled me into the holiday mindset in a way that I wasn't prior to it.
Oh, that's great to hear. This festival really did me a world of good. I hate dark December. I always think of ways to deal. This year's been rough. I knew this December was going to be rough. So this festival did me a world of good. Getting to hang out with you two, who are not only my friends, but you guys are such talented authors. So to get to hang out with such great people and such insightful talents, it went from a time of year where it threatened to be really rough for me, and it just it turned it around to be to be the opposite. It really made my December. So yeah, thanks to you guys, thanks to everyone. It
And
really,
thanks to you for putting it together. It's
Yeah,
been really great.
absolutely. Thank you. And thank you
absolutely,
for inviting me.
oh, an absolute labor of love. I hope um, be seeing you next year. Of course, be seeing you before then.
Dan,
As
can I
well.
recommend
We've got a little bit. What's that?
can I recommend one more book to add to your teetering pile of ghost stories?
Please do.
Maybe you've read this already, but Robertson Davies has a collection called High Spirits, which are all Christmas ghost stories that he wrote to read at the university where he taught, which
Can you tell
Oxford or
me?
Cambridge, one of those two. I can't remember.
High
Um,
spirits, and what's the name again?
his name is Robertson Davies.
My God, I haven't read him since I was a kid.
He's a wonderful fabulist from
Yeah.
the 50s and 60s, I think. I might
Wow.
have all my facts wrong on this.
Well,
But
what's
it's a good book.
one that stands out to you? What's I know from the depths of memory. What's one?
Oh gosh, it was so long ago. But what I remember is that they're very Christmas Carol-like, and that there is a mix of ghosts and humor and high society and all that stuff. They're more charming than scary, certainly.
You got to have a little bit of yeah. It can't be all the darkness of the void. I mean, it could. I'll talk about the darkness of the void, but a little bit of charm in between to wash it down. To wash it down right there.
Islands in the Sea of Despair.
Well, I guess we're going to wrap it up. We're going to play our closing credits. We'll wish everyone a happy Christmas Eve, a Merry Christmas in advance tomorrow. Happy holidays of all the holidays we celebrate.
Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays, Merry Christmas.
Wishing everyone a much better 2021. I hope 2021 is everything it needs to be for all of us. And I hope to see everyone. I hope to see everyone on the other side of this. Look, we're not out of it yet. Be safe, everyone. Be careful. Keep doing the right thing. But when it's all over, we will all be reunited again. And I hope to see you then. So, John and Nick, stick around. Thanks to everyone out there. We're gonna play the closing credits. So thanks for making this first year of the Ghost Story Festival such a great time. And before you know it, be posting what's coming up for 2021. So have a great night.